Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about two of my favorite exercises that it is often really popular for people to say that they're overrated, and that is the press and the deadlift. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. People have their reasons for saying this, and I think where a lot of people get confused, particularly bodybuilding types, or people who are talking about hypertrophy and other things, we'll talk about overhead pressing, and they confuse overhead pressing in general with the press. And when we talk about the press, we are talking about the standing barbell press, where you have a pretty long range of motion, you drive the bar up and you push your head forward. And what people forget is that when you look at this particular variation in EMG studies, it actually hits a lot of muscles a lot more effectively than like your normal seated press does. And so people will talk about it being overrated, like, well, it just basically builds the front delts and a little bit of tricep, and they're usually talking about a seated press. And particularly when you start talking about doing them with dumbbells, yeah, it is an overrated exercise, because with dumbbells, because of the way people do them and they don't turn them forward, they're very limited on range of motion. It ends up being a partial exercise, and we know partials oftentimes have less potential for hypertrophy. And because people do them seated, the bar path itself tends to be very far in front of them. They turn it into a very steep incline because they drive themselves backwards instead of forwards, right? They don't push forward with their torso. They push back into the bench usually, which is already set at a mild incline most of the time. It doesn't have you perfectly upright. And so what ends up happening, it just turns into a really steep incline. And oftentimes it turns into a partial, because most guys on the seated ones don't even touch their chest with a barbell, let alone dumbbells. And so because of that, it's just a partial high incline. And so therefore it does seem to be really, really overrated when you look at it from that perspective. But I think what people need to remember, when a lot of us are talking about the press, when we're talking about the overhead pressing, that's what we mean. We mean the standing press. Well, that is a full body exercise. It involves a lot of the core. It can involve hips. It involves all these different structures in the body, in addition to the fact that we know, based upon the data, that movement you get at the top, because you can move your torso with it, you have a different bar path, that it involves the rear delts a lot more. It can involve the traps more. It can involve the medial delts more. So you're getting a lot more muscles involved. And also when you start looking at even EMG data out of most of your overhead presses, it hits the triceps tremendously harder. So we're talking about an exercise here that actually works a hell of a lot more than what you think of as most of your normal seated overhead presses. So it really is a lot more effective of an overall exercise, and it actually is a better shoulder builder than the seated variations most of the time. Because ultimately they're right, those end up being just an upper chest, and even if they don't come low enough, it's not that great of an upper chest. It just ends up being a front delt and a tricep exercise. Which is not particularly effective. And we have bench presses for this. We have incline bench for this. So when you compare it to those, it does seem to be a lackluster exercise. But when you're talking about the real press, it's actually a very, very effective exercise. It's completely different. They're not really comparable in that regard. And then you come over to the deadlift, and we run into the problems of a lot of people pointing out the deadlift is a partial on most of the muscles involved. And it is, and I will agree, that's one of the weaknesses of the exercise. But we can also counter that with the fact that it is an exercise that works almost every single muscle in the body. It is an exercise that trains you to use your entire body together. So even though there is a lot of isometric strength involved in it, you got to remember a lot of that isometric strength involves different angles changing through it. So it's not the same as some of your real short range of motion isometrics. And even a lot of the muscles in it, yes, it is a partial, so therefore your hypertrophic potential is limited to some extent. It still has a reasonable range of motion, but I think the real benefit to the deadlift is the fact that, again, it trains you to use your entire body as one unit. It tends to load everything very heavily, and I think our biggest downside to it has to do with the fact that, because in some ways it is a heavy partial on a lot of the muscle groups involved, our growth stimulation versus the impact it has on recovery can be a bit skewed. And that's usually the biggest negative we can say about the deadlift, is that the units of fatigue that you can accumulate on this exercise relative to the amount of muscle growth it can stimulate can tend to be a problem. just due to the axial loading and everything. But when you start looking at it from the perspective of what it brings to the table as far as just making you overall stronger and training your body to use all of these muscles as one, all of the stabilizers it builds, and the fact that it does give some growth stimulation to almost every muscle in the entire body, it actually is a really valuable exercise. And I would say, though, that for people who are in hypertrophy blocks in their training, there is a benefit to using, and what I mean by hypertrophy blocks, let's call it high volume blocks, because we know there is no hypertrophy rep range, but periods where you're trying to maximize training volume to get more training stress, and so you're trying to get bigger through volume training. That's where variations of it become more useful. Things like deficit deadlifts, things like snatch grip deadlifts. So that's what we're talking about there. And that, again, kind of a different animal, but it's still a deadlift. But I think what people need to remember, even though these are exercises that people often call overrated, when you think about what they bring to the table, if a person only did 2 exercises and they happen to do these 2 exercises, this is where they're valuable. They're valuable for people who are basically exercise selection minimalists. They become extremely valuable. And what I mean is, if a person were only going to do these 2 exercises and nothing else, but they trained both of these exercises to pretty much their maximum recoverable volume on a weekly basis with as much progressive overload as they could handle, and they did so over and over and over, that person would be pretty big and pretty jacked. And I think it's fair to say that. They would be pretty jacked as a result of doing this. And they would be very, very strong because these 2 exercises lend a lot to your overall strength. And the only thing I would say that would really be lagging on that person, like if a person were to get really strong at both these exercises and nothing else, they would look like they lift. The only muscle that might be lagging on them, seriously lagging, would probably be their biceps. Arguably the quads could use a little more. Maybe the lower chest, but they would have an entire shoulder girdle, right? Their shoulders would be big. And I'm talking all 3 heads of the delts would get some development. Their traps would get development, their triceps, their upper chest, their lats, their glutes, hamstrings, quads to some extent, their entire core. They would be a pretty big, pretty thick person relative to their genetic potential if someone were to just do these 2 exercises. And they would be broad-shouldered, they would be thick, and they would be a strong individual. Because if you think about it, again, the only muscles not really getting worked effectively would be the biceps, arguably the quads, but they would get some stimulation. They wouldn't stay the same size as someone untrained. So if someone did these 2 exercises exclusively, and I wouldn't recommend that you do that, you would actually get a lot of development and strength out of it. They would be a pretty big overall person off of these 2 exercises, even though if you were to go ask people who look at it from the bodybuilding perspective, they would say, oh, that's just a delt exercise and a lower back exercise and a hamstring exercise. That might be with what they would think would happen, but the reality is this person would have big shoulders all the way around. They'd have decent sized arms, particularly the triceps. They'd have big lats. They'd have a big upper chest. Again, arguably the lower chest, arguably the quads, maybe the biceps would be lagging a little bit, some of the show muscles, but everything else would be pretty jacked on that person. They could get pretty close to their maximum development. And so, so what? A person could add a little more other exercises. So when you look at it from that perspective of how much strength they bring to the table, how many different muscles do get a lot of pretty effective work, these are lifts that can really change up the dynamic of your overall training program because they tend to work a lot of things that could end up being your weak links. And they guarantee that you will have a strong core. They guarantee that you have a lot of strong stabilizers. They guarantee that you will be all around strong if you get strong at these 2 exercises. And that will carry over to your other lifts. That will carry over to a lot of sports. These are lifts that really, because of the current bodybuilding world and the state of it and the physique world, they do get a little bit, they're underrated. And a lot of those people say, oh, they're overrated or they're not that good. But then you go back and look, and these exercises were staples during the golden era, even in the physique world, and particularly the standing press, right? Most of those guys back then, and they all had big chest, big upper chest, big shoulders, big full shoulder girdles, particularly considering they didn't have access to the same drugs we do today, which tend to grow your shoulders a lot more. Those guys had really jacked shoulder girdles, and most of them attributed it to this exercise. It lets you cut a lot of the fluff and pump and isolation out that guys are doing trying to bring their shoulders up. You just get really, really strong at the press. You're going to have pretty big, pretty full, pretty wide shoulders as a result of it. So these exercises really bring a lot to the table. And unfortunately, just because of the viewpoint of isolation and working smaller muscles directly, because they are such big exercises that work so many different muscles, they don't tend to be looked at the same way in terms of their ability to make someone big, but actually they really do bring a lot to the table. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.